Hi, I'm Ken Johnson, and I'm here to give you my climate solutions talk for Seniors for Climate. We all know how easy it is to be pessimistic these days about climate change. I'm sure you're all partly here because you worry about it. And who doesn't have the weekly experience of seeing on the news another climate-driven weather disaster, floods in Europe, wildfires in North America, heat domes across Asia or North America? And then in Canada, we watch as we play out as a petrostate, continuing huge annual subsidies of all kinds to the oil and gas industry. Well, I'm here to tell you that remarkably, I am cautiously optimistic about dealing with climate change and averting the worst of it. I've run into three visionaries in particular that demonstrate some light at the end of the tunnel. Some of you will know about them, but I suspect most of you won't. Their names are Amory Lovins, Tony Seba, and Mark Jacobson. They're all brilliant in their own work, and their research groups are a source of inspiration. I'd like to share a few of their ideas and slides today. Here's the overview of my talk and the takeaway messages for today. This is the decade of disruption of energy and transportation. Exponential growth of renewables is driven by technological innovation and huge cost reductions over the last decade. I have cautious optimism that the world could meet its 2030 COP goal of tripling renewables. Here's my first visionary, Tony Seba. He's a part-time prof at Stanford University, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and thought leader on the transition to clean tech for the last 15 years at least. In 2021, he said, "We are on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of energy in 100 years." The build-out of solar in the last decade has been remarkable. Global solar sales have grown 12-fold, i.e. 1,200%. 12 times as much solar as there was a decade ago. Solar sales are now doubling every 2 to 3 years. And where are they going? Here's the projections on how fast they're going to be built out. The growth in the rest of the decade is going to be phenomenal. By 2030, sales are expected to be about triple of what they were in 2023. And this graph is year by year, what they have been the sales and what the expected sales are. Not total solar, but total sales per year. Battery storage sales have grown by 180-fold or 180 times and are now doubling every single year. So here's the batteries to date. And here's what's the estimated build out by 2030. Remember, these bars are sales each year, not the total installed capacity to date. So astronomical growth. In 2023, sales were about 1,000 gigawatt hours. By 2030, they're going to be 6,000 to 8,000 gigawatt hours, or 6 to 8 times that. Battery manufacturing increases and plummeting battery costs are driving adoption of electric cars. In 2015, 1% of car sales were electric. By 2020, it was 5%. We're now at 18%. And by 2020, the end of 2025, they expect it to be almost 40%. And here's the result. The Chinese BYD Seagull, 300 plus kilometer range and an $11,400 US price tag in China. My wife said, OMG at this point when I tried the slides on her, when are we getting ours? Well, I had to inform her that, of course, North American market, they've just added 100% tariffs on the Chinese-built cars. I don't have time to get into the market adoption S-curves or cost curves. Suffice it to say that they explained and predict the pattern of adoption of new technologies, including exponential growth, and are driven purely by economics. So why is the adoption of these clean technology currently so strong? Plummeting costs of clean tech is key. So here are the remarkable drops in renewables that have been happening. Solar dropped 82% in the 2010s and is expected to drop another 72% this decade. Wind costs dropped 46% in the 2010s and are expected to drop another 43% this decade. I mean, this is just remarkable because all the other types of electricity generation technology go exactly the opposite way. Nuclear gets more and more expensive. Peaker plants are more expensive. This is just completely different because it's the nature of the technology. Battery costs fell 87% in the 2010s and are expected to drop another 80% by 2030. Solar is now being installed faster than any technology in history. Such sustained growth in solar is seldom seen in anything that matters. That makes it hard for people to get their heads around what's going on here, this exponential growth, because we think linear. Solar is now the cheapest source of energy ever. And here we have the yellow bar is the drop in solar over the last 15 years. The blue is the drop in wind costs over the last 15 years. You can see that all of the fossil fuels are more expensive. It's now cheaper to install and operate solar or wind than the operating costs alone of coal, nuclear, or oil and gas electricity generation. That's disruptive. So Tony Seba notes that there's a convergence of solar, wind, and batteries, and the cost of the already cheapest source of grid energy will become 70% cheaper this decade. The new technology narrative of exponential growth and beneficial change, a shift to cheaper, faster, and distributed energy. The rapid growth of clean tech is just starting to displace fossil fuels, and that displacement is predicted to increase quickly over the next 25 years, the blue line being solar and wind, the dark line being fossil fuels. And another way to look at it is the amount of investment. Capital has been pouring into clean tech. The first trillion of investment took decades. The second trillion of investment, which started in around 2021, will just take 4 years. And also, you need to realize, of course, as the costs come down, the bang for the buck keeps going up. So it gets the economic argument keeps getting more powerful. This is a quote from this Solar Age article here. To call solar power's rise exponential is not hyperbole, but a statement of fact. Installed solar capacity doubles roughly every 3 years and so grows tenfold each decade. Then this is incredible. The next tenfold increase will be equivalent to multiplying the world's entire fleet of nuclear reactors, which is about 400 of them, by 8 in less than the time it typically takes to build just a single one of them. As a result of these developments, the COP goal of tripling renewables from 2022 levels by 2030 is within range. And where has this super fast growth been? Well, China's been more than half of it. It's just been incredible what they've been doing in China. In a decade, solar has increased 35 times, wind 9 times, batteries and EVs have scaled up even faster. And here's a huge recent solar project, $1.7 billion project in the desert in Inner Mongolia. Exponential growth is also happening in the OECD countries. As well, in emerging economies, a lot of them are going straight for electricity, they're going straight to the renewables. And so we see Brazilian wind, Vietnam solar, Indian solar, and Moroccan wind all taking off in terms of build out. Here's my third visionary. Mark Jacobson is a prof at Stanford and director of the Atmosphere Energy Program. His group models how 100% renewable would work in countries around the world. And Jacobson's group has developed plans through computer modeling for the transition to 100% wind, water, and solar for all purposes. Here's a summary of his world plan, and I won't go into detail, but each of these is a different type of onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, geothermal. And then at the bottom, they estimate that 52 million full-time jobs will be created. The loss from fossil fuel jobs will only be half of that. And here's his plan for 100% renewables in Canada with a slightly different mix. Here's a very exciting example of what's possible. I just want to use this one anecdotal example. Since March 2024, there have been 100 days in California where wind, water, and solar are providing all of the grid electricity for the state at some point in the day. This slide shows the 24 hours of May 25th. Wind, water, and solar provided all the grid energy from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. in California, the 5th largest economy in the world. There was more than 50% excess collection during the afternoon, and a lot of that was dumped into batteries, which were then used to help cover the peak later in the day. Meanwhile, back in Canada, Canada remains an outlier among the G7 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Other G7 countries, including the US, Britain, Japan, have dropped their carbon footprints 20 to 50% since their peaks. Canada levels are still 17% above 1990 levels. Canadian priorities have been mostly fossil fuel expansion. Major tax credits, i.e. subsidies for the floundering false climate solution of carbon capture, $6 billion, which ballooned to $34 billion for the Trans Mountain Pipeline, support for fracked gas pipelines and LNG in BC. However, there have been federal proposals for regulating changing building code, zero emission vehicle sales, oil and gas emissions cap. And these are all recent liberal initiatives that we're pretty happy with, but the implementation timelines for them are anathema to the emergency we're in. Furthermore, in Ontario, $112 billion has been committed for nuclear power, but nuclear power is not a climate solution. It's too slow and too expensive to be one, not to mention risky. And in Alberta, they put a 7-month pause on renewables recently, which undermined investor confidence, even though there were $31 billion of renewables in the pipeline at that point. Overall, the support for renewables has been 1/90th the support for fossil fuels in the time period 2020 to 2022. 150 million for renewables, 13.5 billion per year for fossil fuels. And here's another climate problem in Canada, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. He's in the wings with far more interest in axing the tax, the carbon tax, than dealing with the climate crisis. Finally, I just wanted to mention a different type of climate solution. With our present electoral system, too often the CPC wins seats despite a progressive majority. We must act accordingly and cooperate to prevent this. We are focused on key ridings where a cooperative approach could prevent a conservative win. In conclusion, this is the decade of energy and transportation disruption. Exponential growth of renewables driven by technological innovation and huge cost reductions is changing the landscape very quickly. I'm cautiously optimistic that the world could meet its 2030 COP goal of tripling renewables. And unfortunately, Canada is out of step with these developments. And my final conclusion, for the sake of my grandchildren, I hope the clean tech revolution plays out as is predicted and that seniors in Canada can play a role in making this happen. Thank you for your attention.